The earth beneath you is hard-packed by countless hooves and trampled boots still holding the chill of the steppe night. The yurted around you smells of sweat-damp horsehide and smoke that seeps through the seams in its felt walls. Every sound is magnified by fear, the scrape of a rope against your raw wrists, the shallow breathing of women pressed close together, the groan of timbers flexing in the wind. Beyond the canvas, life does not rest. The camp hums like a vast living creature, the clatter of iron, the bray of tethered horses, the rising and falling shouts of men celebrating in rough voices. It is the sound of victory, though to you it feels like the sound of an entire world collapsing. You are not alone. Faces huddle in the gloom. Some girls no older than 16, others, women, with the lines of years etched into their skin. Dirt streaks their cheeks, eyes darting bodies folded small as though they could vanish into the earth. Some are from your village. Others were dragged from far-off places whose names you may never learn. What binds you together is not language, but fate. You are spoils, prizes, currency. Whatever lives you once had, daughter, sister, wife, no longer matter here. The steppe outside roars with wind. It rattles the felt walls, carries sparks from the bonfires, and whips the banners that mark the commander's tents. That wind is not empty. It carries with it the stink of roasted mutton, the metallic tang of fresh blood, and the bitter sweetness of kumis, fermented mare's milk poured freely into wooden bowls. Horses stamp and snort their heavy bodies shifting in long lines. Warriors tend them even in the dark, for the Mongol army breathes through its herds. Fire discipline is strict, small controlled flames arranged to avoid giving distant enemies a clear target, yet numerous enough to warm soldiers and smoke meat. Everything is ordered, calculated. Even here, in the supposed chaos of a raid's aftermath, the machine of conquest moves with precision. A shadow falls across the yurt's entrance. The flap is thrown back and a gust of cold air sweeps in. A figure steps inside, broad-shouldered, heavy in presence, his cloak rimmed with fur. His eyes are like flint reflecting the faint glow of an oil lamp. You have never seen him before, yet you know him. Everyone does. The stories whisper his name from the Gobi to the cities of the Jinn. Temujin, Genghis Khan, the man whose shadow stretches farther than the horizon. He does not shout. He does not need to. His silence fills the space heavier than the ropes at your wrists. Behind him comes a guard taller still with a scar carved from temple to jawline. The scar bends as he sneers, scanning the huddled women. The Khan mutters a few clipped words in a tongue you cannot understand. The guard obeys immediately, seizing one of the captives and dragging her up. Her muffled cry dissolves into the noise outside. The rest of you sit frozen bodies, betraying you throats too tight to scream. It becomes clear then this is not random cruelty. It is procedure, a system. Captives are not left to disorder. For disorder breeds rebellion and slows the march of conquest. Women are registered, divided, allocated. Some are claimed by warriors, others marked for tribute or ransom. The most beautiful, the most politically valuable, are set aside for the Khan himself or for his family's alliances. In this even your terror is woven into strategy. Outside the Mongol camp sprawls across the darkened steppe like a city of hide and felt. Yurts are pitched in ordered circles, each cluster belonging to a company of men. The central ring houses the commanders, and at its heart the Khan's own camp, guarded by the Kishig, his 10,000-strong household troops. The air buzzes with their discipline. Drunken laughter is loud but never too near the commander's tents. Weapons are sharpened even as men feast. This is how an empire is built, not merely by battle, but by the ruthless organization that follows it. And here you are inside that system, a single thread in a vast weave of conquest. The ropes on your wrists may one day be removed, but the truth presses deeper. You have become property, your body transformed into a tool of war no less than the bows that hang at the warrior's sides. Before we continue deeper into this hidden history of women, pressed into silence of power enforced not just by sword but by flesh, I want to pause. If stories like this move you, if you believe it matters to uncover the buried truths of our past, consider joining this journey by liking this video and subscribing. And as always, tell me where you're listening from. I find it astonishing that across oceans and centuries we can share this exploration together, connected by our shared curiosity for history's untold corners. The Khan shifts his weight, his eyes scanning the room once more. He does not need to touch you to make you tremble. His presence alone is storm enough. You understand with a sinking certainty that the ropes are not what binds you. It is the will of empire. And here in the heart of its camp there is no escape. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe. only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from? Temujin was born into a world that gave nothing freely. The year was 1162 on the banks of the Onon River, where the wind cut sharp across the grasslands, and survival was measured not in years but in seasons. His father Yasugai was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man with horses and followers but not enough to be secure. His mother Hurlun had herself been abducted from the market, stolen away in the night to be claimed as Yasugei's wife. From the moment of his birth, Temujin's life was entangled with violence, with the taking and being taken that defined the steppe. When Temujin was 9, everything fractured. Yasugei was poisoned after attending a feast with the Tatar's enemies, who smiled with their lips while slipping venom into his drink. His death was sudden, and with it the family's fragile protections evaporated. Rivals turned their backs, allies withdrew. In the steppe's brutal calculus, a widow with children was no asset, only a liability. The clan abandoned Hurlun and her children to the endless sky and merciless earth. Hurlun's resilience became their only shield. She taught her sons to survive on wild roots, berries, and whatever small game they could snare. They boiled the marrow from bones long since stripped, drank water thick with silt, and gnawed on bark when even roots ran thin. Hunger was not a visitor, it was a constant companion. Temujin grew up with the taste of society on his tongue, the gnawing reminder that safety could vanish overnight. It was not just hunger that shaped him, but betrayal. Even as a boy, Temujin learned the steppe's most unforgiving lesson. Loyalty is a fragile pact broken whenever advantage shifts. Clans rose and fell in endless feuds, raiding not only enemies but sometimes former allies. On the steppe, friendship was a promise made in one season and broken in the next. This volatility forged in him a different idea that only absolute control could shield a family from ruin. Among his earliest bonds was one with Jamuka, a boy his age who would one day become both sworn brother and bitter rival. Together they hunted, rode, and swore oaths under the eternal sky, pledging loyalty as Anda blood brothers. To Temujin, such alliances were a fragile hope, a thread to cling to in a world of shifting sands. To Jamuka, perhaps they were sincere. But the steppe taught that even brotherhood could curdle into betrayal. The harshness of youth was not without flashes of light. Temujin remembered his father's brief lessons, the importance of horses, of archery, of forging bonds through marriage. Yasugai had once abducted Hurlun to strengthen his clan's lineage. Now Temujin would one day follow the same path, though under far crueler circumstances. By the time he married Berta, his young bride from the Ongirat tribe, Temujin had already known hunger, exile, and the razor edge of survival. Berta was more than wife. She was an anchor, a symbol of stability in a world that seemed determined to rip him adrift. Yet even that anchor was tested. In 1181, the Merkit, seeking revenge for Hurlun's abduction years earlier, raided Temujin's camp and seized Berta, carrying her away into captivity. For Temujin, it was more than a personal tragedy. It was the reenactment of his mother's fate, a brutal reminder that women were bargaining chips in the endless cycle of feud and reciprocity. Temujin would not accept this. Rallying his allies Togrul of the Karait and his Anda Jamuka, he pursued the Merkits with a ferocity born not only of love, but of rage against history itself. He reclaimed Berta, yet when she returned she was pregnant. The child, Yurti, was accepted by Temujin as his own, though whispers of doubt trailed them both. That act of acceptance was not pure magnanimity. It was strategy, a refusal to let gossip fracture the fragile unity he was building. Still the wound ran deep. Betrayal, theft, uncertainty, all tangled together in his family's bloodline. Here lies the psychological seed of the man who would become Genghis Khan. Hunger had taught him to endure. Abandonment had taught him to distrust. The abduction of his wife and the shadow cast over his son taught him that weakness invited humiliation. And so he resolved to build a world where control would be absolute, where no betrayal could topple him, where the fate of his people would not rest on the whims of others. On the steppe, reciprocity was law. A stolen bride demanded revenge. A poisoned chieftain required blood payment. But Temujin's vision went further. He saw the endless cycles of feud bled tribes dry, leaving them vulnerable to stronger enemies. He imagined instead a structure that bent loyalty into permanence, not fleeting convenience. To achieve this, he would need more than warriors. He would need obedience, a system that punished betrayal as death and rewarded loyalty with survival. The boy who once gnawed roots beneath an endless sky was already dreaming of empire. His hardships had burned away illusions, leaving behind a single conviction to endure. One must control not only enemies but allies, not only the battlefield but the household. To command men, to command women, to command fate itself. By the turn of the 13th century, the boy who had scavenged roots and marrow bones was no longer merely Temujin, the abandoned orphan. He had fought, betrayed, bled, and survived long enough to gather men who believed in him. Yet the steppe was still a fractured land riddled with feuds and vendettas, where loyalty dissolved like frost under the morning sun. To become more than another warlord, Temujin needed not just victories, but a transformation of how tribes imagined themselves. That path was paved in blood. His half-brother Bektor was among the first to fall, struck down after a quarrel over food in their youth, a killing that branded Temujin as someone who would not tolerate rivals even within his own blood. Later came the battles against Jamuka, once his sworn Anda, now turned enemy. Jamuka's betrayal cut deeper than most. He had been the boyhood brother-in-arms who shared his blanket, who hunted beside him under the eternal sky. But ambition corroded brotherhood, and Jamuka's cruelty boiling 70 of Temujin's men alive after one clash etched itself into legend. Their war ended with Jamuka's capture. Temujin granted him the noble death, refusing to spill his blood, and thus strangled him. It was a gesture both merciless and calculated, a message to others that loyalty broken could not be forgiven, yet enemies might still be honoured if they bowed to his supremacy. Then came the Naiman, one of the great tribes of the western steppe. Their defeat sealed Temujin's rise. Piece by piece he bound the tribes together not through kinship but through a new idea that obedience to him eclipsed all other ties. In 1206, at a great council by the Onon River, the fractured banners of the steppe gathered. The men raised him upon a white felt carpet, the ritual of enthronement, and proclaimed him Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The title was not just symbolic. It was a declaration that the endless feuds had been broken, that there was now one master beneath the sky. But titles mean little without force to sustain them. Genghis Khan forged not only an identity but a war machine. Unlike sedentary armies tied to supply trains and granaries, his forces lived off their herds. A single warrior might bring multiple horses switching mounts mid-ride to preserve endurance. Their bows, composite layered with horn, sinew and wood, could strike with deadly accuracy, even from horseback loosing arrows while galloping at full speed. Entire cities fortified with walls and moats trembled before an enemy who could encircle them in days' strike from miles away and vanish into the horizon before a counter-attack. Logistics were his true genius. He created the Yam, a relay system of stations stocked with fresh horses, enabling his messengers to carry news across hundreds of miles in a matter of days. This network was the nervous system of empire, allowing him to direct armies as if they were limbs of a single body. The Mongols became not just a people, but a coordinated organism of conquest. Behind this machinery was an equally important invention, the Ordo. On the surface, an Ordo was simply a mobile household camp, a cluster of yurts, wagons, and herds that followed its mistress. But under Genghis Khan, it became a political technology. Each principal wife governed her own Ordo, overseeing not only domestic life, but also trade supplies and diplomacy. These were not idle courts, but functioning ministries on the move. By dividing authority among his wives, the Khan multiplied his reach. Each Ordo became a node of governance, binding conquered peoples into the fabric of empire through marriage, tribute, and daily dependence. At the centre of this web stood the Keshig, the Khan's household guard. 10,000 strong, they were chosen not only for skill but for loyalty. They guarded his person by day and night, tended his mounts, watched over his family, and tracked his movements with precision. To be admitted into the Keshig was to enter the inner sanctum of power, a reward as much political as military. Access to the Khan's tent, his food, his silences, this was a currency as potent as land or loot. It was here in the intimate circle of the Keshig that true influence thrived. Night in a Mongol encampment reflected this layered structure of control. Fires were arranged in strict patterns, with patrols rotating to guard against surprise attack. Captives too were watched, sorted, and accounted for. Even in darkness, the hum of discipline could be felt. Where other tribes might grow lax after a victory, Genghis Khan imposed order. The empire, he believed, must never sleep. Thus, by 1206, a man who had once gnawed bark to survive commanded the loyalty of tens of thousands an army whose reach extended from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of Central Asia. What he had built was more than a coalition of tribes. It was a machine of survival, elevated into a doctrine of conquest rooted in mobility, hardened by betrayal, and stitched together by the cold conviction that only absolute control could prevent the chaos of his childhood from repeating. Genghis Khan ruled not only with horse and bow but with the arrangement of households, for on the steppe domestic life was never separate from politics. At the heart of this lay his 4 principal wives, each of whom anchored an ordo, a mobile court that was as vital to governance as the battlefield was to conquest. Berta, his first and most trusted wife, stood apart. She had endured abduction, borne the doubts surrounding Yuchi, and yet remained the axis of his household. Her word carried weight among generals. Her camp bustled with trade and decision-making. Kulan, gifted to Chinggis after the submission of the Tatar tribe, was famed for her beauty and her voice in council. Yesui, taken from the defeated Tatars, and her sister Yisui, or Yisugen, each brought with them networks of kinship that tied conquered clans more tightly to the Mongol yoke. Together, these women were not passive companions. They were governors, administrators, and most importantly symbols of the Khan's reach across tribes once fractured. The harem extended beyond these 4. Chronicles name 44 wives and concubines. Estimates swell the number closer to 500. Each yurt that housed one of these women became more than a private chamber. It became a miniature court alive with attendants, guards, scribes, and servants. To be chosen as a concubine or wife was to enter a gilded cage, but it was also to stand at a crossroad of politics. Highborn women from conquered dynasties, princesses of the Tangut daughters of Jin emperors, were offered as tribute, their marriages serving as treaties more binding than signatures on parchment. Their presence proclaimed to their people that the blood of their rulers now flowed within the veins of the Mongol lineage. Inside an ordo, life was at once domestic and administrative. Herds had to be managed, sheep counted mares, milked camels, harnessed for migration. Textile production thrummed through the air. Women carded wool-dyed fabrics and stitched garments destined for warriors and nobles alike. Hospitality was a political duty. Envoys, allies, and visiting nobles were received not only in the Khan's central camp, but in the tents of his wives, where feasting and gifts bound strangers into allies. Each ordo became a hub of governance on the move, mirroring the empire's larger rhythms. This system blurred the line between household and state. A woman's camp might control hundreds of people, from artisans to guards, and decisions made in those felt walls rippled outward into the steppe. Berta's ordo, for instance, was not only a domestic sphere, but a council chamber where her advice on matters of war was sought and heeded. Kulan's camp became a nexus of diplomacy, her presence softening the edges of conquest and offering defeated tribes a semblance of continuity through her stewardship. The symbolism mattered. When a defeated ruler's daughter was given to Chinggis, the gesture was twofold: submission and continuity. She carried the honour of her people into a new household, her tent a reminder that even in subjugation her lineage persisted, though now woven into the Mongol fabric. In this way, the harem was less a collection of private desires than a living archive of conquest, each woman's presence recording the story of a tribe, a kingdom, an empire absorbed. To outsiders, the Mongol harem appeared a private indulgence. To those who lived within it, it was a lattice of power, a web spun across the steppes and beyond. In every flicker of lamplight upon silk, in every bowl of mare's milk, offered to a guest statecraft was being practiced. Power in the Mongol world was measured not only in horses and arrows, but also in the invisible hierarchies within the Khan's household. The women who entered that world, whether willingly by alliance or through the violence of conquest, were divided into categories that determined the contours of their lives. At the summit stood the principal wives. Berta, Kulan, Yesui, and Yisugen commanded respect, presided over their own ordos, and wielded authority in governance and trade. Below them were the concubines, highborn captives or gifted brides whose status was elevated but precarious, dependent on the Khan's favour. And beneath them all were the slaves, nameless women seized in raids, pressed into labour, or forced into soldiers' tents after battle. Movement between these categories was rare but possible. A concubine might rise to prominence if she bore a son who earned the Khan's trust, or if her wisdom proved valuable in council. Yet such favour could be fleeting. A woman who fell from grace might be relegated to servitude. Her silks exchanged for coarse felt, her attendants dismissed her. Voice silenced. To live within the Mongol household was to walk a tightrope where survival depended as much on subtlety as on luck. The Persian chronicler Juvayni, who travelled within Mongol domains in the mid-13th century, described women being traded and distributed as if they were livestock. Their worth was calculated not in talents or lineage alone, but in horses, silver, and political leverage. A noble daughter could ransom back her people's safety if handed over as bride. A slave could be bartered in the markets of Samarkand or Bukhara, her body reduced to coin in the empire's economy of blood and conquest. This brutal pragmatism was not unique to the Mongols, but their clarity in treating it as policy shocked sedentary societies. In the Jin dynasty of northern China, daughters of noble houses were married off to cement alliances, yet the practice was veiled in ceremony cloaked in the language of virtue and filial duty. In the Song to the south, elite women lived in rigidly controlled households where chastity and obedience were idealized, their feet bound as visible proof of fragility and subordination. The Mongols, by contrast, had no need for such disguises. On the steppe, a woman was valuable for the alliances she could forge, the work she could do, and the children she might bear. This pragmatism extended into the economics of pacification. When a city resisted and was finally broken, its rulers might hand over daughters and sisters as tribute, a desperate act to halt slaughter. Sometimes these women were absorbed into the harem, other times they were distributed among generals as rewards, or sent back into circulation through remarriage, binding a formerly hostile people to the new order. A widow of a slain noble could be remarried to a Mongol officer, turning a symbol of resistance into an emblem of submission. Even gifting women became part of diplomacy. To send a bride to the Khan was to acknowledge his supremacy, to receive one was to bind oneself to him in obligation. Yet within this framework of commodification, women carved out spaces of influence. A concubine who bore a favoured son might see her status rise, her tent swelling with attendants her counsel quietly sought. A slave who showed skill at weaving or managing stores could be entrusted with responsibilities that lifted her above the nameless masses. Survival often hinged on adaptability, the ability to shift from victim to participant in the machinery of empire, even if that participation was coerced. The logic was cold, but it was consistent. Just as horses were valued for stamina or bows for their range, women were assessed for beauty, fertility, lineage, and utility. In this, the Mongols differed little from other empires, yet they made no attempt to mask the transaction. Where the Song cloaked exchange in ritual and the Jin in courtly rhetoric, the Mongols laid it bare. Women were assets, and their place in the hierarchy determined the survival or ruin of entire families. To be a principal wife was to hold real authority, but even that power was tethered to the whims of a single man and the unpredictable winds of conquest. To be a concubine was to live in luxury's shadow, always aware that favour could vanish. To be a slave was to embody powerlessness, though even their fragments of agency flickered in whispered alliances and small acts of defiance. All were caught within a system that measured human worth in horses, alliances, and obedience, and all bore the weight of a ruler, determined to turn every life into a thread in his empire's web. Before dawn, the Mongol camp stirs like a restless beast. The sound begins with horses' snorts stamping hooves, the rattle of harnesses being checked in the dark. Warriors rise quickly, rolling felt bedding, tightening belts, and strapping on weapons still sharp from the night before. The air carries the smell of ash from smouldering fires mixed with the tang of leather sweat and damp wool. Iron scrapes against stone as blades are sharpened, each rasp a reminder that conquest resumes with the morning light. The women wake too, but their rhythms are different. Some feed infants, rocking them against the cold. Others stoke coals back to flame, preparing bowls of sour mare's milk and the scraps of dried meat for warriors rushing to saddle. Whispers thread through the yurt, fragments of fear, plans of escape spoken so softly they are nearly swallowed by the wind. But most know the truth. The steppe is vast and merciless, and Mongol scouts ride faster than hope. Escape means not freedom but death. Survival then becomes the only strategy. Life for the captives divides along invisible lines. Some are chosen for the Khan's household, their beauty or lineage raising them into a golden cage. They wear silkers taken from Chinese looms, are served fermented milk in polished bowls, and sleep on furs beside low-burning lamps. Yet gilded walls are still walls. Every gesture is dictated by the Khan's whim, every favour revocable. Beneath the glitter lies the knowledge that their lives hang on his attention, an unstable currency. Others endure the grind of invisible labour. They fetch water, tend fires, prepare hides, and scrub the blood from saddles after battle. Their hands are raw, their backs bent, their bodies carrying burdens that blur the line between domestic work and punishment. Some serve as comfort for soldiers, their bodies treated as a reward for victory, their suffering bloodthirst by the clash of drinking bowls and the roar of celebration. Persian observers like Juvayni noted how such women were parcelled out after battles, their fate no more secure than the spoils of armour or livestock. Yet captivity was not contained within the camp alone. A network of routes carried captives outward, flowing into the arteries of the Silk Road. From Samarkand to Karakoram, from Bukhara to Kashgar, women were traded alongside bolts of silk and strings of pearls. Caravan nodes doubled as slave markets where the price of a girl might be tallied in horses, silver ingots, or even falcons prized for the hunt. A noble-born captive could ransom her people if her family still held wealth. A slave of great beauty might be sold repeatedly, each transaction raising her price like a prized commodity. Those less valued disappeared into anonymity, labouring in kitchens, stables, or weaving rooms, their names unrecorded, their lives forgotten. This economy of human bodies was not incidental. It was deliberate, woven into the empire's expansion. Conquest filled the pipeline. Trade distributed the spoils. Just as horses carried armies to victory, captives carried the empire's wealth across continents. A captured artisan might be sent east to craft weapons in northern China. A Persian girl might find herself in a Central Asian market, her price measured against a quiver of arrows or a string of camels. Silver coins struck in conquered cities changed hands with her fate. In this way, the suffering of individuals became invisible fuel for a system that reached from the Caspian to the Pacific. To the Mongols, this was pragmatism. The defeated were resources. Resistance meant annihilation. Submission meant absorption. Women embodied this duality most clearly. They were both symbols of conquest and economic instruments traded, gifted, or retained according to the empire's needs. Their voices were quiet in the chronicles, yet their labour, visible and invisible, kept the empire's wheels turning. As dawn broke over the steppe, the wagons rolled oxen groaning as they strained against loads of felt weapons and grain. The columns stretched, fast smoke rising behind as camps were dismantled with practiced efficiency. Among the carts walked the women, some chained, some simply watched, all carrying their weight in silence. Their footsteps, along with the thundering hooves of warriors, formed the rhythm of empire's expansion conquest, at the front captivity trailing behind, and trade, waiting on the horizon, to turn grief into profit. For Genghis Khan, intimacy was never merely private, it was policy. He understood that to bind the fractious steppe into a single organism, he could not rely only on horsemen, arrows, and terror. He needed lineage bloodlines that threaded through every tribe, every conquered court, every household that once opposed him. The children he fathered were not just sons and daughters, they were living treaties breathing assurances that his authority could not be severed from the people he had subdued. With Berta, his first and most enduring wife, he acknowledged 9 children, 4 sons and 5 daughters. Yuhi, the eldest, was accepted publicly as his heir, despite whispers of illegitimacy. Beside him stood Chagatai, Urgedei, and Tuluai, the pillars who would inherit and divide the empire. Their sisters were married into powerful clans, stitching alliances not through parchment contracts, but through shared blood and grandchildren. Berta's children became the backbone of imperial succession, their legitimacy stemming from her elevated status as chief wife. But beyond the walls of Berta's ordo there were countless others, highborn concubines from the Tangut, the Jin, the Khwarezmian dynasty, captives chosen for beauty, for lineage, or simply for chance. The chronicles name some of these women, but most remain anonymous, their existence marked only by the faint echo of children recorded in genealogies or dismissed into silence. Historians estimate Genghis fathered hundreds of offspring. Geneticists have traced a particular Y chromosome lineage that today appears in an astonishing 8% of men across the former Mongol Empire, some 16 million living descendants. This pattern suggests a deliberate strategy, not an accident of lust. Blood became a tool of statecraft. By fathering children with women from rival tribes, Chinggis ensured that every rebellion risked parricide. To strike against the Khan's house was to strike against one's own kin. Even if loyalties remained brittle, the presence of his blood within their household complicated betrayal. Every child, every grandson, every marriage tightened the weave. Yet the story of genetics demands caution. Modern studies can point to striking patterns like the spread of one paternal lineage across Eurasia, but they cannot prove definitively that every thread leads back to Genghis himself. The Y chromosome marker identified in 2003 by Zerjal and colleagues is likely tied to his dynasty, but science cannot pin it to his body with absolute certainty. Moreover, elite polygyny skews the record in any society where one man fathers children with dozens or hundreds of women. His line multiplies at the expense of others. In this way, power reproduces itself biologically, erasing weaker bloodlines in silence. For the Mongols, this was more than biology. It was politics written into the flesh. Where sedentary states relied on treaties and seals, Genghis trusted in paternity. A daughter married into a noble house meant grandchildren who were loyal by blood. A son born of a captive princess tethered her people to the empire through kinship, however coerced. Even when resistance simmered, these children stood as reminders that the future itself had been claimed. This policy of bloodline expansion was ruthless but effective. It destabilized the frontier, making disloyalty harder to sustain, and it legitimized Mongol supremacy in courts that might otherwise have resisted. To carry the Khan's blood was to carry both burden and shield, a tether to empire that no warrior could sever. And so, as the yurts of his wives and concubines filled with children, the empire's foundations grew not only from stone siege engines and burning cities, but from the cries of newborns. Each was another thread in a net cast across continents, ensuring that Genghis Khan's presence would outlast his campaigns, his victories, even his death. The legacy was not merely an empire that spanned from the Pacific to the Caspian, but a genetic echo carried silently in the bodies of millions, a testament to how power in his hands was inseparable from the intimacy he weaponized. The guard's hand is heavy on your arm as he leads you through the camp. Fires crackle low, casting wavering shadows across the felt walls of the yurts. Warriors still feast, their laughter rising in bursts, but their eyes follow you, measuring, dismissing, or lingering with unspoken intent. The night air bites at your skin, sharp with the scent of trampled grass, smoke, and blood. Ahead, a larger yurt looms its entrance, flanked by two guards whose spears gleam like fangs in the firelight. The flap parts and you are pushed inside. Warmth envelops you at once. The air is thick with incense and the musk of animal pelts. A low lamp burns its smoke, curling like a serpent toward the domed ceiling. Furs line the ground, soft under your bare feet. At the center sits a man who needs no introduction. Genghis Khan, his braids streaked with grey, his face carved with lines of weather and war. He is not armoured, not shouting commands. He sits cross-legged on a low stool, his hands resting on his knees, a figure of stillness in a world built on violence. Before him lies a map. Its parchment edges curl like dried leaves, its surface marked with rivers, mountains, and symbols inked by steady hands. We often think of the steppe as boundless and trackless, but here in this yurt the world has been captured, reduced to lines and strokes of black on pale hide. Stones weigh down the corners, and small tokens, pebbles, carved wood, bits of bone are placed upon it. These tokens are not idle decoration. They mark armies on the move, cities besiege future routes of destruction. The map is the Khan's other battlefield, a place where conquest unfolds before the first arrow flies. He does not look at you immediately. His eyes are fixed on the cartography of the empire, scanning its curves and marks as if reading omens. The silence stretches until it becomes unbearable, pressing on your chest harder than the ropes once did. When he finally speaks, his voice is low, almost soft, yet heavy with command. You do not understand the words, but you understand their weight. There is no choice here, only survival. Around him, attendants move with quiet precision. A scribe stands ready with a brush recording messages to be sent by the yam, the relay system of horses and riders that binds the empire together. A guard kneels to refill the lamp, careful not to disturb the Khan's concentration. Even in this intimate space, discipline reigns. The Khan's moods are studied like weather. When his brow furrows, men lower their voices. When he leans forward, orders ripple outward. His temper can be storm or sun, and every life in the camp depends on reading its signs. This is the paradox of power. Genghis Khan's authority radiates not from noise, but from stillness. His silence is more frightening than another man's roar. To sit in his presence is to feel the breadth of his control extending from the farthest outpost of the empire to the single moment in a felt-walled tent. Yet even here intimacy is never personal. It is political. To be summoned into this yurt is not an accident, but part of a system. Women are as much tokens on his map as the stones that mark cities. To be chosen is to be absorbed into a web of strategy, your fate no longer your own. You stand trembling, the lamplight catching in your eyes, the fur beneath your feet sinking like quicksand. The Khan does not rise, does not approach. He does not need to. His gaze alone is command enough. In this space of incense and maps, survival means obedience, and obedience means erasure of the self. The world has been redrawn and you are part of its ink. The fires of conquest spread outward, consuming not only villages and tribes, but entire kingdoms. By 1215, the Jin dynasty rulers of northern China faced the full weight of Genghis Khan's armies. Their capital Zhongdu, the city we know today as Beijing, stood proud with towering walls, moats, and gates of iron and wood. For centuries, Chinese dynasties had trusted stone and earthworks to shield them from the nomads of the steppe. Yet against the Mongols, these walls became a prison. Genghis Khan had learned quickly from those he conquered. Chinese and Khitan engineers captured in earlier campaigns were pressed into service. They brought with them the secrets of siegecraft catapults capable of hurling massive stones, firebombs of oil and resin, even primitive gunpowder devices. Mobile siege towers creaked into place and tunnels were dug beneath walls to collapse them. For the Mongols, who had once relied solely on speed and the bow, these foreign techniques became new weapons. Mobility combined with engineering was devastating. Where the Jin had prepared for raids, they now faced an army that could batter down their strongest gates. The siege of Zhongdu dragged on for months. Inside, famine gnawed at the population. Chronicles tell of desperate measures, citizens reduced to eating bark leather and worse. Outside, the Mongols waited patient and merciless. Reputation itself became a weapon. Entire towns had already surrendered without a fight, terrified by tales of what happened to those who resisted. It was not only arrows and fire that broke Zhongdu, but fear. When the city finally fell, the slaughter was immense. Women were seized, households stripped bare, treasures carried away in wagon columns that stretched for miles. The capital of a dynasty collapsed into ruin, and the Mongol name became synonymous with inevitability. 4 years later, Genghis turned his gaze west. The Khwarezmian Empire, stretching across Persia and Central Asia, had potential as a trading partner. At first, there were overtures of peace. Envoys were sent, gifts exchanged. But in 1218, a caravan of Mongol merchants arrived in Otrar, only to be accused of espionage. The governor Inalchuk had them executed and their goods seized. For Genghis Khan, this was more than insult. It was an assault on the sanctity of envoys, a betrayal that demanded blood. The retribution was apocalyptic. In 1219, Mongol forces poured across the Sir-Darya, their advance rapid and unstoppable. City after city fell, Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgent, each subjected to massacre or enslavement. Bukhara's mosque was said to have been used as a stable, a symbol of utter humiliation. Samarkand's defenders, once numbering in the tens of thousands, were outmaneuvered and crushed. Engineers forced into Mongol service turned their skills against their own cities, building the engines of their destruction. At Otrar, the punishment was particularly savage. Inalchuk, the governor who had slaughtered the envoys, was captured. Chronicles describe molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a gruesome execution designed as both vengeance and warning. The population of Otrar was annihilated or dispersed. The scale of enslavement defies imagination. Tens of thousands of women, children, and artisans were seized and scattered across the empire. Skilled craftsmen were spared death only to be marched east, resettled in Mongol strongholds, where their expertise could be bent to new conquests. Markets from Samarkand to Karakoram thrived on this sudden influx of human chattel. Entire communities vanished overnight, their survivors carried away to feed the machinery of empire. What made the Mongol tide so unstoppable was not sheer brutality alone, but the psychological momentum it generated. By the time armies reached a city's gates, its defenders were already trembling under the weight of reputation. Stories of Zhongdu's starvation, of Bukhara's humiliation, of Otrar's annihilation moved faster than the horses themselves. Fear galloped ahead, opening gates that might otherwise have withstood siege. Thus, conquest was not only written in fire and stone, but in rumour and memory. The Mongols turned terror into policy, ensuring that each act of devastation was not just punishment, but performance. Every massacre whispered to the next city, resist, and you will share their fate. Surrender and you may yet live. For some it worked. For others, hope and pride outweighed fear, and the result was ruin. The empire of Genghis Khan did not endure by the sword alone. It was held together by rules, flexible, pragmatic, and often shaped by the same hard lessons that had carved his youth. This body of custom and decree became known as the Yasa. Yet unlike the formal legal codes of China or Persia, the Yasa was not a book of statutes read aloud by clerks. It was partly memory, partly precedent, and partly the Khan's words spoken in a moment of crisis. Its strength lay not in parchment, but in fear and loyalty. In the early years, punishments were uncompromising. Adultery could mean death, not because of morality, but because betrayal of the marriage bond could spiral into blood feuds between families. Theft of livestock, a crime that endangered survival itself, was punished with execution. The message was clear: in a fragile world, disruption of order was intolerable. Yet as the empire expanded and absorbed diverse peoples, the law adapted. Later accounts describe fines replacing death sentences, especially for sexual offences. Practicality, not dogma, drove these changes. Executions weakened the population. Fines enriched the treasury and kept the empire intact. Where other cultures sought to control women through ritualized fragility, the Mongols recognized their necessity. In the Song dynasties to the south, foot-binding crippled women into symbols of obedience, their bent bodies reminders of male dominance cloaked in ideals of beauty. By contrast, Mongol women strode with unbroken feet across the steppes, driving ox carts, tending herds, and even riding into battle when needed. Widowhood carried no stigma. Single women moved through society without the suffocating restraints of Confucian codes. This freedom was not equality, it was survival logic. The empire could not afford to waste half its population in immobility. Berta herself exemplified this agency. As chief wife, her counsel was sought in matters of war and alliance. Chronicles suggest that Genghis trusted her judgment, and her ordo functioned as a miniature court where her voice carried weight equal to generals. She managed the distribution of goods, oversaw tribute, and was consulted in moments of uncertainty. Her authority was not symbolic. It was active governance exercised through her tent walls and this vast network of attendants under her command. Nor was Berta unique. Across the encampments, Mongol women took on responsibilities that blurred the line between domestic and political. A camp-born woman might manage a caravan's stores, negotiating with traders for bolts of silk or sacks of grain. Another might arbitrate disputes between herders over grazing rights, her word, carrying the force of tradition. Some women commanded wagon trains directing oxen and camels as the ordo migrated across hundreds of miles. These tasks were not male or female. They were necessary, and necessity bred authority. This pragmatism gave the empire resilience. While conquered peoples often marvelled or recoiled at the liberties Mongol women appeared to enjoy, those liberties were never about ideals of equality. They were about survival and cohesion. To hobble women, as in the Song practice of foot-binding, would have been unthinkable on the open steppe where every hand was needed to keep wagons moving and herds alive. Thus the Yasa itself reflected this spirit: harsh when survival was threatened, lenient when cohesion required compromise. It was not sacred text, but living memory adjusted to circumstance. In this we see Genghis Khan's genius not only as conqueror, but as lawgiver. He understood that power lay in adaptability. Law was not to bind the empire in rigidity, but to weave its fragments into a whole. And within that weave, women were not ornaments. They were threads tensile, necessary, and often decisive. Their agency might not have been written into chronicles, but it was lived daily in the dust of the caravan road, in the counting of sheep, in the quiet words whispered into the Khan's ear before he mounted his horse to ride. Rumour moves faster than horses. In the vastness of the steppe, where written words were scarce and secrecy impossible in a world of thin walls and open skies, whispers became their own kind of weapon. Among the women in the yurts, captives, concubines, and slaves' stories circulated in low voices, carrying warnings, lessons, and sometimes tiny embers of hope. One such story clung to the figure of Jamuka, once Temujin's sworn ander, a blood brother, with whom he had shared a blanket as boys. The tale said that when they were young they slept under the same furs, bound by an oath of loyalty as enduring as the sky itself. And yet Jamuka became his fiercest rival, a man who broke that oath and waged brutal war. In the story's retelling among the women, the detail of the shared blanket was more than anecdote, it was horrible. If even bonds of sworn brotherhood could sour into betrayal, what security could any woman hope for in the shifting tides of Mongol power? The whisper served as warning: trust, lightly guard your heart, for loyalty on the steppe was always provisional. Aisha, a Khwarezmian captive with eyes like sharpened glass, was one of those who kept such stories alive. At night, when the guards' footsteps faded and the camp's roar dulled into the snorts of horses and the hiss of dying fires, she leaned close to other women and traded news. Who had been moved from one tent to another? Which concubine had gained favour? What city had fallen? Her voice was a thread stitching together fragments of knowledge. To the powerless, information was currency. To know the Khan's mood, to anticipate a transfer, to prepare for a march, these could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Rumour functioned as survival technology. Captives lacked swords, lacked alliances, lacked even full freedom of movement. What they had were ears and tongues. They listened to guards boasting after drink, to merchants haggling at the camp edge, to the mutter of scribes as they copied orders. They carried these scraps into the darkness and wove them into narratives that explained their condition, predicted dangers, or suggested slivers of opportunity. In the absence of agency, rumour became a tool to map the world beyond their confinement. Enslaved Kansas communities throughout history have done the same. In the Caribbean plantations centuries later, enslaved Africans passed coded messages and songs. In medieval Europe, serfs shared tales of lords' scandals as a way of undercutting authority. Among the Mongol captives, the practice was no less essential. A whispered story might warn a woman not to defy a guard known for cruelty. Another might hint at a chance for escape when a caravan split. The truth of these stories mattered less than the cohesion they created. Believing together gave women a sense of agency, however fragile in a world designed to strip it away. Sometimes rumour softened the brutality with fragments of humanity. Women spoke of a concubine who managed to influence a decision of the Khan, sparing a tribe from slaughter. Or of a wife who persuaded her husband to protect certain captives. These were rare, perhaps embellished, but they reminded listeners that not every outcome was predetermined. Hope, too, could travel by whisper. In this way, rumour was not merely idle gossip, it was resistance of the quietest kind. In the long shadows of captivity, where official chronicles erased their voices, rumour allowed women to write their own version of truth, fluid, collective, and whispered against the roar of empire. After the sack of the city, silence did not last. The Mongol machine moved quickly, and what remained of the population was not left in chaos, but folded into a brutal order. Captives were herded into groups sorted by age, skill, and beauty. Warriors selected immediately what they desired: horses, weapons, women, while the rest were catalogued like plunder. The Keshig, the Khan's household guard, oversaw the process with meticulous care, recording numbers and destinations. Even in devastation, bureaucracy thrived. What looked like the ruins of a city was for the Mongols the beginning of redistribution. The fates of these women diverged sharply. A handful, especially those of noble blood or striking beauty, were placed into the gilded cage of the Khan's harem. Their yurts were lined with furs, their garments of silk, their lives watched closely, yet privilege was fragile. A concubine who lost favour could find herself demoted overnight, sent from lamplit luxury to the drudgery of fetching water or scrubbing hides. The steppe allowed no permanence except the Khan's will. Most women, however, knew no silks. They were scattered among soldiers as rewards or pressed into the hard labour that kept the army alive, tending herds, cooking, grain patching, garments. Others were driven in columns along caravan routes destined for markets in Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, or beyond. In these bustling nodes of the Silk Road, slaves were bartered alongside pearls, spices, and bolts of damask. A young woman might be priced in horses, another in strings of silver coins. A skilled artisan could fetch more than a soldier's ransom. Here, human lives became commodities valued in the same breath as falcons or carpets. The logistics of this trade were chilling in their efficiency. Way stations built for the Yam courier system doubled as holding pens for captives, where they were fed just enough to keep them moving. Imperial tax farms extracted revenue from slave sales, skimming profit from misery. Even caravan insurance, a service offered to merchants, began to treat human chattel as insurable cargo. The empire's reach was so wide, its paperwork so precise, that atrocity was disguised as administration. On scrolls and ledgers, people vanished into numbers, their suffering erased in neat lines of script. What might appear as chaos, the aftermath of fire and blood, was in truth highly structured. Slaves moved through channels as predictably as silk or jade. Guards escorted them to ensure profit reached its proper destination. In the eyes of the empire, this was not brutality but policy. And yet for those living it, the weight of this system was unbearable. Women torn from their homes found themselves bent under loads, their children pried from their arms, their futures traded in markets where no one spoke their language. Some disappeared into the Khan's household, others into the anonymity of labour, their names unrecorded, their stories silenced. This was the market of tears, a system that turned grief into currency, survival into sale, and lives into lines of ink on parchment. It was here in the cold precision of ledgers and the rhythm of caravans that atrocity was normalized not as chaos, but as business. By the 1220s, the Khan was no longer the hungry youth gnawing at roots beneath an endless sky. He was a man in his 60s, grey streaking his braid, his face weathered into a map of scars. Yet the fire of conquest still burned. Campaigns pressed relentlessly outward into the lands of the Khwarezmian Empire, deep into Persia, south toward the Tangut Shia, who dared to resist yet again. The empire, vast as it was, seemed never satisfied. But even Genghis Khan could not outpace time. In 1226, while riding in pursuit of the Tangut, he fell from his horse. The accident left him weakened. Rumours swirled, some said broken bones, others whispered of internal injury. He concealed it as best he could, continuing to direct campaigns, but those close to him saw the strain. The image of invincibility mattered, and he refused to show frailty before the warriors who believed him favoured by heaven. By 1227, the Xia capital of Yinchuan was under siege once more. The Tangut had broken their promises of loyalty, and Chinggis was determined to crush them utterly. Yet as his armies closed their iron circle, his body betrayed him. He grew feverish, his strength fading. Even then he gave orders ensuring no rebellion could rise at his death. For a man who had built his empire on control letting go was unthinkable. On August 18th, 1227, in the midst of campaign, the Khan died. His body was carried away in secrecy, hidden from the eyes of enemies and allies alike. The chronicles diverge here. Some say he was buried near the Onan River, where he was born. Others whisper of a grave in the Kentii Mountains. Marco Polo, writing decades later, claimed that to keep the site unknown, soldiers slaughtered all who witnessed the funeral procession, thousands of slaves and attendants put to death so that no tongue could speak of it. Why such secrecy? On the steppe, a leader's grave was not merely a resting place, it was a potential target. To know where the Khan lay was to risk desecration theft or rival claimants using his remains as symbols. Concealing his burial was both protection and strategy, a final act of control. Even in death he was to remain untouchable, his presence more legend than corpse. Mortuary rites reflected the tension between nomadic custom and imperial scale. Traditionally, steppe burials were simple, a mound of stones, perhaps a horse sacrificed to carry the soul into the next world. But Genghis Khan was no ordinary man. He demanded a ritual commensurate with empire, yet one constrained by the urgency of campaign. His body may have been shrouded in felt, his favourite horses slain, his guards mourning in silence as they erased all trace of the grave. No monuments marked it, no temple announced it. His absence became his legacy. For the empire, the concealment mattered as much as the conquest. A grave could divide loyalties, sparking pilgrimages or rival claims. By erasing the site, Chinggis' heirs ensured that his presence belonged not to one tribe or valley, but to the entire empire. He was everywhere and nowhere, the eternal storm of the steppe. And so the man who had redrawn the world with fire and blood vanished into the earth in secrecy. The siege of Yinchuan raged on. The war did not pause for mourning. Even in death, Genghis Khan's will pressed forward, the machine of empire grinding without rest. His grave remained hidden, his body swallowed by silence, while his shadow rode on in the minds of those who feared and revered him. The death of Genghis Khan did not dissolve the empire. His armies continued their siege, his banners still rippled above the steppe, but for those within his household the world shifted overnight. The man whose will had held every thread taut was gone, and with him the certainty of place. The orders of his principal wives were not dismantled, but reassigned, absorbed into the authority of his sons. Berta's household passed naturally into the sphere of her surviving sons, especially Ögedei, whom Chinggis had named as successor. Other wives and concubines were distributed as tokens of loyalty parcelled out among sons and generals like land or treasure. For the women, this transfer was not ceremonial, it was survival. Their status, once secured by proximity to the Khan, became volatile. A favoured concubine might suddenly find herself relegated to a distant camp. Another, overlooked during the Khan's lifetime, could be elevated if her new guardian valued her connections or her children. Inside the household, succession was as much about flesh as it was about thrones. The empire divided into ulus appanages, granted to each son, and with those lands came fragments of the harem. To be attached to Tolui rather than Chagatai, to Ögedei rather than Yuki's heirs, could alter a woman's fate entirely. For the children born of concubines, legitimacy now mattered more than ever. Some were recognized as princes and princesses, others relegated to obscurity, their mothers' names vanishing from record. Amid this reshuffling, women did not remain passive. Quiet networks of influence stretched across tents and caravan trails. A concubine might call upon the friendship of another wife to secure a safer placement. Older women whispered advice to the young how to flatter a new master, how to protect one's children, how to disappear into obscurity if survival demanded it. Resistance was rarely open rebellion. It was endurance, subtle maneuvering, the weaving of invisible alliances. For those of lower status, the aftermath meant harsher realities. Slaves were sold off to new households, driven along caravan routes as if they were spoils freshly taken. The administrative system recorded the transfers with cold precision, names omitted, numbers tallied. The bureaucratic order that had made captivity a machine continued to grind even without the Khan at its helm. And for you, the captive who has lived through these shifting tides, the reckoning is personal. Once you dreamed of home, of finding your village again, of hearing the voices of kin. But as years pass, that horizon fades. Home has become an echo blurred by the weight of survival. You know the steppe winds better than the streets of your childhood. You know the rhythms of Mongol camps, the pre-dawn stir, the grinding of wheels, the long shadows cast by endless herds. The ropes that once bound your wrists are gone, but you live within a larger tether, the empire's machinery from which there is no release. The Khan's death was meant to fracture his legacy, yet for the women left behind, the effect was both fragmentation and continuity. Some clung to fragile security within new households, others slipped into obscurity, their lives swallowed by the empire's vastness. Yet in whispered counsel, in shared bread, in the quiet acts of protecting children, or softening a master's wrath, women carved out a thread of agency. The empire might have lost its centre, but within its camps the women learned once more the lesson of the steppe. Survival lies not in strength alone, but in adaptability. To endure is its own form of resistance, even when the horizon of home recedes into memory. When Urgedei, third son of Berta and Chinggis, took the title of Great Khan in 1229, he inherited not only the empire's vast lands, but also its arsenal of fear. The machinery of conquest did not falter with his father's death. If anything, it became sharper, its terror wielded with theatrical precision. The Mongols had long understood that violence was more than destruction, it was performance. And under Urgedei, that performance reached new stages. Chroniclers record that in 1237, during the campaigns against the Oirat and other resisting peoples, thousands of girls were raped in public, their families forced to watch before they were dragged away into slavery. The atrocity was not concealed, it was a deliberate message, a warning inscribed on the flesh of victims, so that their cries would echo farther than any messenger could ride. Such acts, barbaric in their cruelty, were as much about communication as they were about conquest. To us these events read as horror, and they were, but to the Mongols they were policy. Exemplary violence worked. When news of a massacre preceded the army, entire towns often capitulated without resistance. Gates were opened not in hope but in terror of what would happen if they stayed shut. This logic of fear saved the Mongols' resources. Why spend weeks battering down walls if rumour alone could unbolt them? Why squander warriors' lives when one atrocity could purchase a dozen surrenders? The calculus was cold but efficient. Every act of mass terror carried both a cost and a return. The cost was administrative bodies to sort captives, to process resources, diverted to manage the influx of slaves. The return was psychological dominance, entire regions pacified before arrows were drawn. It was a balance that Chinggis had pioneered, and Urgedei continued perfecting the art of conquest through dread. Yet chronicles themselves wrestled with how to record such horrors. Persian writers like Juvaini and Rashid al-Din did not shy from describing massacres, but their accounts often carried a double edge. On one hand, they condemned the brutality, presenting it as divine punishment on sinful peoples. On the other, they marvelled at the efficiency, acknowledging the ruthless logic behind Mongol methods. In Chinese records, atrocities were framed as both humiliation and inevitability, the price of failing to resist the fate of a dynasty that had grown weak. Moral accounting was uneven, filtered through the agendas of those who wrote, yet the underlying reality remained: terror had worked. For the captives, of course, there was no such calculus. Terror was lived in flesh and bone, not in chronicles. A woman torn from her family did not think of administrative costs. She thought of the silence where her home had stood, of the shame carved into her body, of the children she might bear into a lineage she had not chosen. These personal tragedies were the invisible ledger on which the empire's profits were tallied. Urgedei's reign shows us how violence became theatre staged, exaggerated, and carried on the winds of rumour until it shaped decisions in cities the Mongols had not yet reached. Fear galloped ahead of the cavalry and invisible vanguard. To resist was to risk annihilation. To surrender was to gamble on survival. And so atrocity was normalised not as breakdown but as strategy. The empire expanded built as much on the psychology of submission as on the clash of arms. And in that expansion the lives of the conquered became both message and medium, their suffering the ink with which the Mongols wrote their dominion across half the world. On the surface the Mongol camp seemed unified. A sea of yurts, wagons, herds and banners moving as one across the steppe. Yet inside two different worlds of womanhood coexisted, worlds separated not by distance but by fate. For freeborn Mongol women life was demanding but carried authority. They strode with unbound feet across the grasslands, managing herds, directing ox carts and bargaining with traders. They spun wool into thread, felted it into cloth-stitched garments sturdy enough for warriors to ride through winter gales. They milked mares, churning the froth into kumis, the fermented drink that flowed through every feast and council. These tasks were more than chores. They were forms of power, each skill a proof of belonging, each responsibility a voice in the household's survival. Captive women lived beside them, but in a different sphere. Confined to tents under guard, they performed labour without agency. Some fetched water until their shoulders ached, some tended fires until their hands cracked from smoke and ash. The fortunate few were placed in the Khan's harem, surrounded by silks and furs, yet stripped of freedom, their lives dictated by the shifting winds of favour. For them, every day carried the same calculus: obey, endure, survive. The difference was not only in status, but in texture. A Mongol wife stirred a cauldron of curdling milk knowing it would feed her sons, her tent, her ordo. A captive stirred the same cauldron and tasted only alienation, her labour, feeding the very system that held her captive. One woman's felt rug was a symbol of her family's prosperity, woven with care and pride. Another's rug was a burden produced under orders, its pattern not her own. Yet even across these divides, moments of shared humanity flickered. One night when the wind howled down from the mountains and the camp settled into uneasy quiet, a Mongol woman, not a captive, but one born to the tribe, brought a bowl of warm mare's milk to a foreign girl trembling in the dark. Her hands were rough, her face weathered, yet her gesture was gentle. She taught a few Mongol words in a patient murmur, pointing to fire, to water, to bread. In that moment, survival was not a command, but a kindness, chinus. These acts did not erase the system's cruelty, but they revealed its contradictions. The very skills that gave free women authority, dairy craft, textile work, the mastery of horse culture, were the same tasks captives were forced to perform without recognition. The difference was not in the work itself, but in ownership of its meaning. To churn milk as a free woman was to sustain one's kin. To churn it as a captive was to feel each stir as a reminder of chains. The Mongol world descended on these skills. Without mare's milk, warriors lacked their staple drink. Without felt yurts collapsed in wind and rain. Without women's hands guiding wagons, the ordo could not migrate. Power, therefore, was encoded in material labour. Free women drew status from it. Captives drew exhaustion. The same grass that nourished herds became through women's work the fabric of empire. Thus two worlds coexisted within the same camp. One built on mobility and authority, the other on confinement and silence. Yet in the rare exchanges of food words or shared labour, the walls between them blurred, if only for a heartbeat. And in those heartbeats, even within empire's machinery, fragments of humanity endured. History leaves silences as deliberate as any sentence. In the case of Genghis Khan, the greatest of these silences lies in the secret history of the Mongols. Written in the 13th century, it is our closest Mongol account of the Khan's rise. It exalts his genius, recounts betrayals and victories, even records quarrels within his family. Yet when it comes to the subject of women taken in conquest of captives used as spoils of the violence written into their bodies, the text falls quiet. The silence is not ignorance, it is omission. To celebrate empire, one must veil its cruelties. Other sources give us fragments. The Persian historian Juvaini, serving Mongol administrators in the mid-13th century, writes with both admiration and unease. He describes the dispersal of women, the markets where they were traded, the punishments inflicted on those who resisted. Rashid al-Din, a century later, preserves traditions of atrocities committed under Ögedei and his brothers. Chinese records, especially from the Jin and Song courts, speak of daughters of noble houses surrendered as tribute of entire communities of women parcelled out after sieges. Yet all of these accounts are filtered through distance, through political agendas, through the lens of the conquered. What we glimpse is real but partial. The truth lies not only in what is said, but in what is absent. Administrative documents, lists of tribute registers, of booty tallies, of livestock and slaves mention numbers but not names. 50 girls taken, 200 women distributed. To the empire, these were assets measured alongside the sheep and horses. To us, they are echoes of lives unrecorded. Behind each number stood a person with a family, a history, a voice erased by the quill of a scribe who reduced her to ink and line. And yet centuries later, their presence lingers in unexpected form. Genetic studies reveal a paternal lineage spread across millions of men almost certainly tied to Genghis Khan's dynasty. 16 million living today may carry his Y chromosome marker. But what of the mothers? Their names are missing, their stories untold. The empire's chronicles recorded the fathers with pride, but the mothers has disappeared into silence. The genetic echo resounds with their absence, a reminder that history has preserved the conqueror's seed, but not the women who bore it. This is the historian's dilemma. What can we infer and where must we stop? We know from Giovanni's tally that women were traded like livestock, from Rashid al-Din that mass rapes served as deliberate punishment, from Chinese envoys that noble daughters were offered as living treaties. But we cannot reconstruct the individual voices of the women themselves. The record is not lost, it was never written. Thus the archives of empire are also archives of absence. To study them is to trace the negative space, to read the silences as carefully as the words. When we see 50 girls on a ledger, we must imagine 50 lives. One may have been a shepherd's daughter, another a merchant's wife, another a princess. Their diversity collapses into a statistic, but their reality remains. In this way, every list of booty, every levy, every gift recorded in the empire's bureaucracy becomes a shadow map. It tells us not who these women were, but how they were valued by the system that consumed them. And in those shadows we glimpse the cost of empire, not only in blood spilled on battlefields, but in lives erased from history's page. The ropes are gone now. Years have passed since that first night when the tent flap opened and the shadow of the Khan filled the space. Your wrists are free, your body older, but the memory of the coarse rope biting into skin has never faded. The weight of it lingers as real as the smell of horsehide and smoke that once pressed around you. The empire he built begins to fracture. His sons quarrel, his generals stake out new territories, the once united storm disperses into many winds. Cities fall, still caravans move still, but the pulse is different, less a single heartbeat, more a scattering rhythm. And yet for the women bound within its machinery little changes. The system outlives the man. The silence in chronicles remains, the erasure continues, the scars endure. You sit in the camp, older now, gazing at the horizon. Home has dissolved into memory blurred by time, until even its outline feels imagined. The life you were forced into has become your only reality. What remains is not the rope itself, but the memory of what it taught, that empires survive not only on blood and conquest, but on the normalization of horror. Violence becomes routine, written into law, disguised as custom, folded neatly into paperwork and tallies. When atrocity is administered like a tax, it ceases to feel like atrocity to those who wield it. That is the lesson which stretches beyond the steppe. Institutions, whether ancient or modern, often cloak cruelty in procedure. A scribe's ledger reduces women to numbers. Today a former database or a legal code can just as easily reduce people to data points, each stripped of story. Intimacy, whether the forced intimacy of a captive or the coerced intimacy of personal information, remains a weapon when used without consent. The mechanisms change ink to pixels, parchment to servers. The principle endures. For the powerless, survival lies in memory, in refusing erasure. Rumour kept women alive in the camps, passing knowledge in whispers. Today, memory itself is an act of defiance, to name what systems would prefer forgotten, to recall not only the conquerors but the conquered. Dignity lies not in silence but in the insistence that even when records fall quiet, the lives behind them are not forgotten. So we return to you, the woman in the tent. The empire around you shifts and crumbles, but your story lingers, even if only in fragments, even if only in imagination. You are not a statistic in a ledger, not a nameless figure in a chronicle's silence. You're a reminder that beneath every line of ink, every tally of spoils, lies a human life with grief, resilience, and memory. The quiet historian's cadence closes here. Power thrives on forgetting, but dignity is remembering precisely. To see the mechanism, to name it out loud, and to refuse the next invitation, whether dressed as law, tradition, or necessity, that asks us to trade away our humanity for the comfort of empire. Across the sweep of the Mongol Empire, one truth echoes louder than the thunder of hooves: conquest is never only about swords and cities. It reaches into homes, bodies, and memory itself. The story of Genghis Khan's rise and rule shows us how power can reshape even the most intimate corners of human life: marriage, family, survival. Yet within this darkness lie lessons that remain urgent for us today. The first lesson is about normalization. The Mongols codified their violence. Captives were sorted, tallied, and dispersed with the same care as livestock. Sexual violence was not presented as chaos, but as a policy folded into law and logistics. Here lies the warning. Atrocity becomes most dangerous when it is disguised as routine. History shows us that the greatest threats to human dignity often do not arrive with spectacle, but in ledgers, decrees, or procedures that make suffering seem ordinary. Whenever a system invites us to accept cruelty as just the way things are, vigilance becomes a moral duty. The second lesson is about fear as a weapon. Cities from Zhongdu to Samarkand often surrendered without a fight undone, not by catapults but by reputation. Fear galloped ahead of the Mongol cavalry, breaking walls before a single stone was thrown. We may not face siege engines today, but fear still shapes choices: fear of exclusion, fear of poverty, fear of shame. When fear becomes policy, whether wielded by government, an employer, or a community, it can force compliance without open violence. Recognizing fear as a tool of control allows us to resist it and to stand firm where silence would otherwise be coerced. A third lesson comes from the women whose names history did not preserve. They were categorized as wives, concubines, or slaves. Their identities reduced to numbers in chronicles. Yet they carried the empire on their backs, tending herds, moving caravans, raising children, and whispering survival into one another's ears. Their absence in the record reminds us that silence is not emptiness, it is erasure. In our own time, the stories that go untold are often those of the marginalized, the vulnerable, the unheard. To honor them requires listening carefully for what is missing, not only for what is written. There is also a lesson in adaptability. Mongol women of free birth managed trade-guided ox carts and advised generals. Captive women, though stripped of choice, still found ways to carve out survival: sharing language, passing rumors, protecting children. Survival was itself a form of quiet resistance. Life often demands the same of us when control is beyond reach. Resilience comes not from grand gestures, but from small, persistent acts of endurance. Finally, the overarching lesson is this: dignity lies in memory. The Mongols concealed the grave of their great Khan, but they could not erase the traces of those who suffered in his shadow. To remember precisely naming the mechanisms of control, refusing to let silence hide them, is to reclaim dignity for the forgotten and vigilance for ourselves. History's hidden stories remind us that power can corrupt the most intimate human acts, but they also show us that survival, memory, and compassion remain stronger than fear. To see clearly, to name cruelty out loud, and to choose humanity over compliance, these are the defenses that endure long after empires fall. If you've enjoyed uncovering the hidden truths behind history's most scandalous and inspiring figures, don't let this journey end here. Subscribe to Hidden Timelines today and join a community of curious minds exploring the stories history tried to bury. Hit that button, ring the bell, and never miss the next tale of power, survival, and resilience that still echoes into our own lives. Your next secret from the past is only a click away.